Hello and welcome. Today's webinar, where we look ahead at the new calendar year with an eye towards identifying sales opportunities, has not only been the one that Jim and I enjoy putting together the most, but also become our most anticipated event of the year. And I want to begin by thanking all of you who submitted the topics and areas of interest you wanted us to cover in this session. Our research team had a heck of a time going through and compiling. We did our very best to group questions and address as many of those as we received as possible. And as we were preparing today's comments, one theme became clear quite early: the theory of uncertainty. And while some major uncertainties are now behind us, such as U.S. presidential elections, by region, by industry, and so forth, major uncertainties still exist around the world. To shed some light on those and answer those questions, I welcome back the presenter and host of the webinar series, Jim Melillo, Chairman and co-founder of Executive Conversation. Jim's broad career experience includes CFO experience in both public and private companies with corporate development, treasury, mergers, and acquisition. Jim, before I turn the presentation over to you, I'll let everyone know we'll run about 30 minutes and also answer any additional questions that may arise during the presentation at the end of this webinar series. Jim, without further ado, let me turn the presentation over to you.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, everybody. Like Eric, I want to thank the dozens of people that sent us quite a few questions, and we're going to talk about breaking them down into small groups. I also want to thank the 10,000 people this year who registered and signed up, as well as the many companies that have supported this series. And you can see their names up here. If your name's not here, feel free to send us an email. More importantly, feel free to share this series with the other people in your group. We basically broke our areas down into 4 macro topics and 3 major industries. Those appeared to be where people were looking to drive change. And as always, this is not a theoretical. It is more around how do you apply the information to your opportunities in this coming year. And the other thing is, as always, when we start off the year, we always started off with the ability to have a poll. So I'm going to open up the poll. And so, Eric and Sean, if you would, let's put the polls up and let's see what people have to say. I expect my sales quota over the next 4 quarters to increase, remain the same, or decrease. As always, 20 seconds is the most time we're going to give you for the poll. Let's have the people. I see more and more people are joining every second. We're well over 200 already. 5 more seconds. Just click a button, if you would. Fantastic. So let's close the poll, and let's see what kind of answers we've got going on. Eric?
Jim, our audience is being tasked with a tall order heading into the next 4 quarters. Overwhelming victory for increase at 85%, 14% remaining about the same, and only 1% with the decrease over the next 4 quarters.
Fantastic, and I'm glad to see the technology is working. Just moved up to a new type of tablet with a pen-based stylus, and I really like the looks of it. So with an increased rate for the vast majority of people, the question then becomes, how are you going to do that? We're facing a series of macro events that are coming up. The first one is fiscal uncertainty. Regulatory compliance or interference will be continuing significantly. We'll take a look at GDP growth by region and R&D investment. These are the 4 macro topics we had questions about. In addition to that, we're going to take a look at how does that fit with where you're going. What does the fiscal cliff look like? Well, as a person with a master's in economics and an MBA, I'm going to say to you that it breaks down into 3 things. One is do nothing. Doing nothing, of course, reduces our GDP. People are predicting as much as 4%. I find that to be a little high, but to be honest with you, no matter how you look at it, it's going to be significant. The biggest impact is going to be on government spending. Most likely that's going to be down 6 to 9%. One of the things, though, that people should be aware of is that it reduces the deficit this year by half. And we'll see why that's important. Obama has proposed an opportunity, and that opportunity that they proposed is basically more taxes from the successful people of the world and also a minimal reduction in the deficit. Here's one of the problems we have. Our GDP to deficit ratio is running at 108%. To put that in perspective, Greece is at 160. We all know how bad that is. But Italy, which we've heard has significant problems, is at 118%. We just talked about the U.S. at 108. And Spain, another country that's problematic, is at 72%. So when you look at these three different countries, what you can see is that we're already at 108%. Not reducing the deficit is going to move us to where these countries have had higher interest rates. And the third one is the middle course, and that's going to be what we predict will happen, which will be a combination of taxes and reductions. What happens? So if we hit the middle course, we expect GDP to grow at 2.5% to 3%. Well, what that means to you is that your quota is going to be 4%, 6%, 8% growth. Your underlying buyer is going to be growing at roughly 2.5% to 3%. It's going to vary by industry, and we'll show you that in a sec. So if you've got a 6%, 8%, 10% quota growth, and your customer is only growing, GDP, nothing more than all your customers put together, growing at 2.5%, that means you're going to have to take market share from competitors. Now, if you have a choice of where to sell to, here are going to be the three hot areas of growth. Healthcare, we're looking at 7+%, consumer electronics and telecom. Slower financial growth and utilities. So we're going to have slower growth with financial services, utilities. We're going to see slower growth in oil and gas, not because of exploration, but because there's huge increases in gas production in the U.S., and thus we expect to see a slowdown in spending. All this means is what becomes critical, as we've talked about all year, is you need to focus on growth where my company is looking to grow, and you need to focus on helping me cut costs in those industries where I'm focusing on slow down growth, lower demand for my services. Second topic, regulatory compliance. Take a look at the top line. You can see the number of regulations that have been added in the last year. You can take a look and see also the approximate cost of this. Now, the person who put this slide together, I will go on record as mentioning, used the Heritage Foundation, a noted conservative group. Nonetheless, here's what we can see over time, regardless of what administration's in power. We also know that there are three huge areas that are coming on for the regulatory. The Dodd-Frank, it's only a quarter done. Obamacare, also known as the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, and global warming. How do you deal with this? How do you make money from it? Well, the first one, massive amounts of big data come out of this. What a great opportunity for those of you that are in the business of helping to collect, archive, audit, process that big data. Regulations lead to data. Data leads to uncertainty. How do you help me with that? Second of all, with that data, I need to create transparency. I need to bring order to my personnel records. I need to bring order to my emails. I need to bring order to my travel. I need to bring order to fill in the blank, manufacturing, R&D. And so thus, as a result of that, I have to recognize that reducing risk is becoming critical. Whether that risk is in corporate, whether that risk is worker comp, in this, whether that is safety. We'll talk about that particularly in the oil and gas business. Decision makers are looking for ways to find solutions that have a cost and risk component. One of the things that I was amazed at were the number of people that had no problems talking to me about reducing cost when they came to sell to me as a CFO. No problems in finding maybe 25% of the people who had no problems talking to me about how they could affect my revenue. But I would say to you, the number of people that recognize the cost, the downside, or the hindrance of risk was probably in the 5% range. This year, risk is going to be a big issue. You, no matter whether you're selling travel services, pharmaceutical, or technology, have the opportunity to address it. You're not going to be the whole solution, but I'm looking for the partners. A partner is someone who works with me on my business issues. I know I'm going to have hundreds of companies it will take for me to run my business. I'm just looking for those one or two partners that understand my business. The rest of you, we can call vendors. Third major trend is growth rate. And I wanted to put up two charts. Growth rate in Europe, growth rate in the U.S. And I'm just going to go back and forth as you take a look at these. As you can see, the European growth rate, not only going forward, we hear about it, but also in the most recent 3-4 years, has been radically different than the U.S. In the U.S., although we, quote, have been stumbling, nonetheless, we look like the giant engine of growth with these, what are historically small numbers, compared to when you look at the European. So what does that mean? Well, it means a couple of things. The U.S. is projected to be at around 2.5 to 3%, which is right there. What's astonishing about this chart is very simple. Look at the number of countries in the areas that are to the left of that. When you take a look at who's going to grow faster, China, India, and various others, the U.S. economy and the domestic situation is not to be overlooked. So, once again, here's the macro issue. How does it apply to you? If you're selling to European countries that are going to be working domestically in Europe, you're going to be talking to them about cost cutting for at least 3 years. If you're talking to European companies that have focused their investment on the USA and Asia, you're going to be talking about growth. As a matter of fact, we have seen a significant increase in European car makers manufacturing in the U.S. and then re-exporting. Again, growth-oriented for European organizations selling in the U.S. and Asia, cost-cutting when they're doing it domestically. U.S. is going to focus on domestic and BRIC growth. The BRICS are coming back. As many of you remember, they got down to the X. India and China were the only two growth engines. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, we're expecting all four of them to have a resurgence of GDP growth, definitely in the 5 to 7% range. Your U.S. company is going to be looking to go and rebuild, resell, continue to grow in those areas. You've got to drive my ability to go global. Your solution has got to be seen in a global context. I know your territories in Birmingham or Akron or L.A. Nonetheless, I'm going to be talking to hundreds of companies this year. I'm looking for one or two that are going to be partners around this opportunity of going global. How do you link to global? I don't expect you to take me global from Akron, but I do expect you to understand that. You know, Jim, everybody's sort of gone global. This coming year, China's going to build, buy, and use 22 million new vehicles. One of the first times, as I mentioned in earlier broadcasts, any country is going to do more than the United States. The United States is going to this coming year, build and buy 15 million vehicles approximately. Harley-Davidson will ship, in 2012, 389 motorcycles to China. Everybody is not global. China will buy and build 22 million vehicles. Harley will ship 389. We know that GM is firmly encased. We know that there are over 90 automobile companies there. Everyone is not global. Please, if you've got a U.S. manufacturer that's looking for growth, most likely that growth is going to be global, how do you become part of that? You've got to take advantage of the fact that the earth is flat. Great book written by Freeman. If you haven't read it, it's a wonderful read. He also has another one, Hot, Flat, and Crowded. Nonetheless, what that says is that technology and data allow you to impact anywhere in the world. Take advantage of that. How does your solution help me as a healthcare organization that is looking to expand from my hospitals here in the U.S. to hospitals in the Arab world, the Asian world, the African world, the South American world. How do you help me take advantage of that? Because the earth is flat, data is transparent. And thus, when you change your value and develop this discussion, it's got to be now. Now is the time we as executives are building next year. Don't show up in January. As a CFO, January is the 4th month of the year. I'm starting in September to build 2013. By January, I'm already in my 4th month of thinking about this. Get to my office this week. The last one is the R&D challenges by institutions. R&D is what separates high-cost countries of the world to low cost. It's what allows countries to grow. It is the investment particularly for developed countries. As you can see, R&D has a lot of components. Take a look at these components. Who do you sell to? Government, mostly domestic corporations, international corporations, and then, if you would, take a look at the areas where you have the largest opportunities and link to it. Because when you work with R&D, you help me overcome high costs by linking global research and development. You help me reduce long timetables. You help me reduce uncertainty. All the industries we're talking about, manufacturing, healthcare, energy, gas, all have benefited or have been hurt by the lack of R&D. Coming years, we're going to see research and development become core to growth. How do you link your products to that? How do you help me reduce the amount of time my research and developers spend traveling and increase the amount of time they spend researching? How do you help me build a global R&D force? How do you help me share and reduce that risk? And so we know that the balancing act that's going on here, depending on the industry, depending on the country, is either going to be on growing the revenue or reducing the cost. The 3 industries that were highlighted were healthcare, energy, and financial services. We had a 4th one, exports, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Where do we see healthcare going? Healthcare is going to be up 6 to 7%. Again, this is a real problem for the U.S. We have a GDP growth of 3%. Twice as fast healthcare growth means more money comes out of other parts of your country and goes into just keeping your country alive. Within that, medical devices are going to see flat pricing. And so increased utilization is going to become core for those people selling to those types of healthcare companies. There's going to be a growth in low-cost delivery locations, a growth in the use of technology for A, the patients, in other words, linking to the patients, and B, the business of healthcare, treating the patients. And what we will continue to see is an increased number of patients per physician. And that doesn't mean the physician is going to spend less time with you. It means that you need to help healthcare figure out how to treat more people utilizing solutions you have. How do you take advantage of this? 1, focus on shifting from volume to quality. Healthcare Act, the PPACA, or Obamacare, is basically going to reward people on quality, not just volume. And so you need to begin integrating your solutions into these goals. And the most important thing if you're selling to a healthcare organization is you've got to create a path between where you are and where you're talking with that organization today to 2014, 2015, when the Patient Protection Act kicks in. Remote solutions are becoming critical. Not only do we need to get the information to patients, but you also need to help me utilize lower cost or remote locations. That requires integration, and the most important part is you need to help me create almost a seamless group between patient, physician, and payer. Any way you can link to that, either through technology, either through products, either through services, either through solutions, that then becomes the critical way you win revenue and you win market share in healthcare. Energy is interesting. So this is the energy growth from 2005 to today. Nothing new about that. What you see down here, and it's a little bit confusing, this chart, is this is the percentage increase that each one of these groups, China, U.S., and other, is going to do. And again, we can see 1%, 2%. And so what we're seeing is the U.S. is going to be growing and consuming not a huge growth in forms of fuel. We're going to see mostly substitution. FedEx as well as UPS have both made a commitment to switch their vehicles from gasoline and diesel to natural gas. We're seeing power plants making the switch. So that all requires investment in information, investment in technology, investment in large production of heavy equipment for conversion. How do you link to that change? What are the other opportunities we see? Well, we're going to have increased infrastructure needs as what happens is we switch from one type of fuel to another. Product safety is becoming significant. As a matter of fact, most firms in the mining and in the extractive resources businesses have set safety as one of the critical success factors for bonuses for executives. So again, aligning around this, critically important in extractive resources. Not quite sure that paper cuts among software programmers is going to be a big deal, but in the mining, the oil and gas, and the others, that industry has embraced it. The other problem is being able to get resources to the correct place. For those of you that listen to our discussions around Australian mining, where the average truck driver makes in excess of $125,000, heavy equipment maker $150,000, $170,000. Getting water, getting information, getting people, moving things is becoming more and more expensive as the resources are not where they're needed. How do you help me? Dealing with legislation and political realities. Again, the complexity of regulatory and the risks that come around that. The risk of corruption and fraud, I'm not quite sure you have a solution for it, but how do you have the ability to help me create transparency? The financial services industry is fascinating. What we do is we put up this chart, and it's hard to see, but basically you have France, UK, Germany, Italy, over here, China, and then down on the right side you have Argentina, Mexico, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia. And what this says is that countries like this, France, 421% of their GDP is in banking assets. Now, obviously, the French are not hiding huge amounts of gold or huge amounts of cash. What this says is that French banks tend to do and export their business model. And so these countries on the left side are doing banking not only in their country, but are gathering huge amounts of assets outside their country. On the other hand, countries like this, the vast majority say that those are foreign banks that are coming in and gathering assets. What's interesting is the United States sits here in the middle. Huge opportunity for financial service groups in the U.S. to grow their business globally. That number is 117%. That means roughly, if we were to do $1 trillion in GDP, that would mean we have roughly $1 trillion of assets in the bank. If the French were to do $1 trillion in GDP, this would mean they have $4.2 trillion of assets in the bank, assets they've gotten from other countries. So when we look at this, growth in financial services globally becomes important. How does your solution locally help me go there? How do you help me deal with consumer trends? How do you help me figure out how do I utilize this information and how do I process it? Products are becoming more complex. I've got cost pressures and expansion going at the same time. What's your discussion with me in this area? The recent studies have shown that 70% of all information you walk in and talk to me about, I already understand. 70%. That means your traditional way of addressing me is a waste of time. That means that your old story no longer fits. That means that I know probably as much about you as you do. So you've got to change the conversation. Going forward with these 4 macros, with these 3 industries, you're going to be facing smarter decision makers, more aggressive, looking for higher ROIs, and they're looking for either closer alignment or delegation to vendor status to how big a price cut can you give me. It's going to be less about you, more about my change. As you take a look at this statistic, and it is astonishing, you've got to recognize that when you walk in and as you get ready to speak, if you're not talking about these issues, you're wasting time, you're wasting their time, and you're wasting yours. We continue to provide information like this on our blog, on our LinkedIn group, and Twitter. Feel free. We've got 4 more years of the Democratic mandate, regulatory increases, R&D pressure, European cutbacks. How are you going to focus your time and energy? Look, every one of these discussions is about your personal ROI. The only thing you have to invest is your time in your customers. You need to choose where are you going to invest your time. You need to choose where are you going to put your effort. Do not choose to just come forward with me with the same discussion, and do not, for your own sake, come forward and think about either always been a big customer, thus that's where I need to spend my time. We're changing as buyers. You have to change as sellers. You've got to turn to becoming a partner. So, who's your worst enemy? Who's your toughest competitor? And who's responsible for your success? The answers are all the same. We've seen the enemy, and they are us. We've got a few minutes left for questions. I'm going to open it up to Eric. If I don't get a chance to wish you all Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, let me do it now. And Eric, what questions do we have?
Jim, great presentation. Thanks much. Whole host of questions grouped under the general area of referencing things like the pending fiscal cliff here in the U.S., having an implication that decisions are being pushed out, meetings are being rescheduled until the January timeframe, lots of delays coming out of this uncertainty. Questions about what kind of strategies or reactions to those types of developments might you suggest?
I think, and you're extremely right. Every CFO and CEO I'm talking to has been putting hiring decisions on hold. They're putting investment decisions on hold around the tax effect. And it goes much further than that. There's also a structural problem. Right now, the United States alone has $1.5 trillion as of last month sitting offshore in profits that have not been recaptured. So this is not only a problem with the fiscal cliff indecision, it's a problem that goes much larger. A couple of things. One is you need to drive high ROIs. Regardless of the tax rate, if you've got a return on investment that is at 1.5, 2 times my internal rate of return, which is roughly 18 to 22% for the Fortune 500. So if you're bringing me ROIs in that 30% range or more, that's going to say, regardless of tax effects, that has an opportunity to affect me. The second one is reducing risk. Risk has to be reduced regardless of what the fiscal cliff looks like. We've got to prevent accidents. We've got to prevent people from going to jail. We've got to prevent people from paying out exorbitant payments on natural catastrophes. Risk is endemic to business and helping reduce that. So I would suggest to you those are 2 of the areas that are easier to get attention around.
question referencing a number of the stats you shared that most regions, most industries expecting rather modest growth in the coming quarters. Interest rates also expected to remain fairly low. What are you seeing in terms of the impact accounts are having with respect to their hurdle rates? Are you seeing their rates going up or down? I think I recall you citing a couple points there where ROIs were tending to trend upward. That seemed to be perhaps in contrast with some of the downward stuff we're seeing.
Interesting, when people go into a time of uncertainty, they require a higher return. And it is a problem that creates a great opportunity. A good example was during the recession, we saw people with 50 and 100% hurdle rates. Effectively, they had no idea when we were coming out, and so only projects that had absurdly high returns were being voted on. So right now we've got uncertainty, and thus we're looking for higher returns. Again, I've talked about this in talking to 20, 30 different Fortune 500s at least. 18 to 22 is the range of annual internal rate of return required on projects. You have to remember, most of us are borrowing here in the corporate world at between 1.5% and 2%. So this is already a huge spread. The CFO, me, borrows at this rate, and I lend to you, the VP of R&D, at that rate. So we have the spread already, but I would suggest that until the uncertainty is over, those rates may go up, like I said, possibly to 30% in order to get attention.
We're bumping up against the top of the hour. I'm going to squeeze a couple last questions in for you. One industry you didn't cover specifically was manufacturing. Thoughts on that sector?
Yeah, manufacturing is, and it's been one of the great growth engines of the last 3 years. All people have to do is look toward Caterpillar and Boeing and various other heavy manufacturers besides the General Motors and the car companies I mentioned before in China, and their ability to grow their business by exporting constantly, not only products made in the U.S., but also a mixture of U.S. technology embedded into manufacturing in other countries. That will continue to go on. As the BRICS are coming back, they're going to continue to need heavy infrastructure. They're going to continue to need manufacturing capabilities in order to enter and compete in new markets. The ability to work with those companies will be a nice 5 to 7% growth rate that I think most people working with customers like that should expect in their quotas. And again, if you're taking market share or if you're changing the underlying way in which we deal with business, that number, that growth rate can easily go well beyond that 5 to 7 into the 10 to 20% range. We saw that with healthcare as healthcare began shifting in the last 3 or 4 years around the beginning to now the middle of Obamacare. We'll see that same growth rate, I believe, for the next 12 to 18 months in heavy manufacturing for export.
Time for one last question. You mentioned government growth going backwards in the U.S., obviously austerity programs taking place in other countries. What do you see happening in the broader public sector over the coming quarters?
I think the best guess people have is 1 to 2% government shrinking. I think it's going to be disproportionate depending on what happens coming out of the discussions going on between Congress and the President. I think we can expect to have a reduction in the Defense Department budget in real terms going forward for the next several years. I think the first cut is going to be around $80 billion with the wind down of Afghanistan. We're seeing other secondary departments, agriculture and the others, are taking hits, but they're quietly because they're smaller. The big question is going to be health and human resources. Obamacare has already created cuts. If you don't meet the Meaningful Use Acts, they're going to cut 1 to 2% of your reimbursement for Medicare and Medicaid. That's over 50% of all the health care costs in America. So at the federal level, that's what we see going on there. At the state level, you see various balancing acts. In California, they've raised an additional $6 billion for their income tax. Other states have not been able to pass that. So at the state level, you're going to have, I would suggest, depending on what state you're in, either a boom or a bust.
Well, Jim, much appreciation for a wealth of insights shared here. Everyone, thank you for joining us. We've kept you a couple of minutes after the hour. Happiest of holidays to you, and may the upcoming year be your best yet. This concludes today's webinar.
Eric, and thanks everybody for a great year. Take care.